since I've been very interested in the right to water and indeed the right to food for a number of years, as a philosopher interested in global issues, it seemed very appropriate for me to try and give a lecture on water. I have to say that we do have a member, a trustee, Dorcas Pratt, who works for Water Witness and is far more expert on the detailed issues of water and what should be done about access to water and so on. And what I'm going to be doing is reflecting in a more general way, as befits a philosopher, on whether talking about rights and human rights and talking about the SDGs, in particular the one about water, as it were, is helpful to strengthening the commitments of governments and individuals to do something about it. And this is why I want to explore this issue tonight. I must say that a couple of days ago, when my wife asked me what this lecture was on, I said, oh, it's the right to water. I'm wanting to argue about water being a basic right. And she said to me, well, that's self-evident, isn't it, Nigel? With the implications, why do you want to give a lecture on it? And I'm hoping that after my half an hour or so speaking to you, you don't share her opinion. You want to burst the candle listening to all this stuff from me on it. But I hope I can open up one or two issues for people in a way that is very interesting. Another apology, my life's been a bit full of various things happening this last couple of weeks, which I didn't expect. And I'm reminded my father had a business friend who received a 2-page letter from his bank manager saying, I'm sorry, I haven't had time to write a shorter letter. And you might feel, well, this could have been compressed more, but we'll see how we get on. So anyway, Paul, if I come to the next slide. First thing I want to sort of just state, it's pretty obvious, but I think it's just worth spelling it out why. It seems to me the right to water is a basic right, like food, right to food, because water is a basic good. It's one of the key elements that makes up human beings flourishing. I can later consider what rights mean, what the implications of rights language means, but I just want to focus first on why is water so incredibly valuable? Why is it that water is a basic good? Well, water, like food, health, and shelter, is a crucial dimension of living. But life isn't just to be understood merely as continued biological existence, though clearly water is necessary for that, crucially, but also life in a richer sense, to mean a full, healthy, meaningful life in which people develop their potential and do worthwhile, interesting things. And I'm going to suggest that water is equally crucial to that. So next slide, please. And I want to sort of just make a general point, since our organization is about development and aid, is that if development and aid are meant, and the aid that which is meant to support development, is good for anything, these things, development and aid, are good because more and more people are unable to lead lives, full, rich lives of the kind I've described briefly. And if you understand the right to life in this way as being a right to a cluster of basic goods that make up such a life, then I would also argue that it has ethical primacy. By ethical primacy, I mean it's something we ought to be concerned to ensure. Is it okay? Yeah. By ethical primacy, I mean that it has importance from the point of view of other people and the responsibilities they have to help realize it, as I'll explain more fully in a moment. But it's for two quite different reasons that the right to life, which includes the right to water, right to food, and so on, it has ethical primacy. Because, first of all, whatever else people wish to do with their lives, and of course people have a wide variety of views about what they want to do with their lives and make of their lives, the careers they have, the hobbies they want to pursue, the interests they want to pursue, or what philosophers sometimes call their particular conceptions of the good. Whatever these different views people have about what's important in their lives, if we didn't have these basic preconditions of adequate clean water, healthy food, etc., then the pursuit of these other goals is either very difficult or made very or almost impossible. So that's one crucial thing why these things, like the right to water, right to food, I mean, basic levels of clean water and edible food. The reason why these are important and have privacy is because they are preconditions of the rest of what makes life valuable. But secondly, the right to life, including the right to water and food and so on, can be said to have privacy because the lack of these is a particularly acute form of natural bad or evil, if you like to use the word evil, in themselves. So they're having a clean water, adequate clean water, and having adequate nutritious food, it isn't just good because it enables us to do other things that we want to do. It's crucial in itself because hunger and thirst and so on, other things like that come from lack of the proper amount of food and water are serious evils in their own right. So this is two reasons for saying this. So next slide. Now, just to make a general point about foreign aid, which we're interested in, clearly sometimes foreign aid is directed at emergency assistance, and that clearly includes the provision of water when there's droughts and so on. But its primary focus should be on what's called development assistance. So we do development education here. We call it global citizenship learning now, but it used to be called development education. And development assistance is much richer and wider than emergency assistance. It's about creating the conditions or enabling people to have who do not already have secure and sustainable access to water and adequate food, etc., precisely to be able to acquire it and have it and keep it. In other words, it's about creating conditions in which, in a sustainable way, people have access to water and adequate food and so on. So the question I want to ask in this lecture is, what ethical or other arguments underlie the commitment to aid and appropriate development, including access to clean water and sanitation? And I want to ask then the question in particular, do the SDGs help in this, help reinforce these commitments, which may seem self-evident as my wife thought? Do these SDGs, do they help reinforce these commitments? And likewise, do they appeal to human rights, reinforce these commitments? There are various other things we could talk about, but I'm just going to focus on these two in these remarks. So next slide, please. I've just put that up because although those two are talking are completely familiar with this, but it's just there. Rather than have some picture in my slideshow, because I tend to have words on my PowerPoint. I know lots of people do whistles and bells these days, but I'm very socially old-fashioned to like a few words there. So anyway, that's as you all know what the 17 goals are. But let's now focus on goal 6. Next slide. So goal 6 is to ensure availability and sustainability of the management of water and sanitation for all. That's the goal 6. It just says water and sanitation in brief, but the longer specification of the goal is what you probably can't see on the screen just a moment. It's locked off by. But what's really more interesting, and this may be something you've all looked at, and maybe not, is that all the Sustainable Development Goals have a whole lot of targets, which you can sort of dig down and get on the website. And they're all very similar in form. By 2020, we will achieve so, by 2020, we will make progress on something of such and such. And there are, well, nominally 6, but sort of slightly more when you'll see at the end, targets underlying this this goal. And the targets, the first 3, you can see, are by 2030. Now, the first 2 are the most crucial and important ones. If you want to study the targets, they're worth looking at and thinking about what does this really mean, how realistic it is, and so on. Because the target 1 says, by 2030, achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. So that is quite definite. This is something that everyone should have achieved in the world by 2030. So that's a fairly precise target. The second target is also equally precise. But by 2030, achieve access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all and end open defecation, paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. So those two, and the rest of the targets are actually in different ways means towards things that need to be done in order for those first two targets to be achieved. So the targets have a sort of hierarchical order. They're not all equal standing. They all have a different role to play. The first two are the crucial ones, and the other ones are not crucial, but they are, as it were, what to do to implement them. The next three are sort of more technical ones to do with. These are the kinds of things we have to do in the world with appropriate aid programs. And the last two are more socioeconomic background things. These are background conditions for achieving the same. So let's move on to the next slide, which has the rest of the targets. So 2030 is a sustainable increase. Now, this is a very interesting increase in all sectors to ensure sustainable withdrawal of supply of water, of fresh water to address water scarcity. And then 6.5 says by 2030, implement integrated water resource management at all levels, including through transboundary cooperation as appropriate. So that's another specific target, which is pretty definite. The 6.4 is sort of like increasing, substantially increasing, and 6.5 is about achieving certain kinds of water management systems, integrated water resource management systems. So the next one is quite interesting. Remember, it was 2015 that these were agreed. By 2020, protect and restore water-related ecosystems, including mountains, forests, wetlands, rivers, aquifers, and lakes. And we missed that target quite badly already, but it's interesting that was put in there, and it is an important dimension to the background protection of good water resources. And then we have two further targets, which are, as it were, not 6, 7, 6, 8, but 6A and 6B. And you may wonder why that is, because they're now dealing with a different kind of thing that's needed to do with international cooperation and capacity building. It's a good UN phrase, capacity building. So by 2030, expand international cooperation and capacity building to support in developing countries water and sanitation related activities. So that's why that one's a different kind of goal, but it says expand, right? And then 6B says support and strengthen the participation of local communities in improving water and sanitation management. Again, to do with another kind of means to do with increasing participation. So I just wanted to go over these because maybe you've never thought particularly about these targets, but it's just interesting to see how they're structured in a certain way. That you have primary targets, which are the key things to achieve, and then you have other things that need to do to enable them to be achieved, and then you have further down background, broader background considerations about cooperation, capacity building, and participation of local communities. I'm not criticizing this, I'm just pointing this out because it seems to me it's interesting that this is how a lot of these documents are structured and understood. There are different aspects to what's needed. So that's just a quick run through. I thought you might like to just have a quick run through these the goal of this target. So let's go on to the next slide. As I said, it's the first two, as I say, are the key ones, and the others are means in different senses. But the crucial question I want to ask, and this is the knotty question, is we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, but whose goals? They're just goals. So the question has to be, whose goals are they? Now you might say, as somebody once said about the economy, well, it's the international community's goals, stupid. But then the international community is a rather vague and amorphous entity. What do we mean by the international community? Do we mean the UN and its international other bodies or its agencies and so on? Do we mean individual countries or governments acting separately or collaboratively? Do we mean NGOs? Whose goals are they? Or do we mean people like ourselves as responsible citizens? Is it our goals? Do we think that these are the goals we have? And I think it's a question worth asking. Well, we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, but what exactly does that mean? But then there's another kind of question, which has puzzled me for a long time. Goals are exceedingly slippery. Goals are not clearly one thing. It can mean a number of things. And it's often people talk about, oh, my goal is to have a tidier garden or something like that. It's an aspiration, something sooner or later I'd like to achieve. The good reason for doing it, but it's not. It's my goal, but it's more like an aspiration. It's something we all recognise we're really good as the world have more equitable access to water for everyone and so on, and all the other things. So is it a sort of vague aspiration? Well, it's more. Well, in this context, I think people say no, it's more than that. But next becomes the crucial. Do we mean by a goal in this context the active commitment to pursue it, let's say by governments or NGOs or the international UN body? Do we mean an active commitment? But this active commitment is alongside, but limited by other commitments, because we have all sorts of other things. So that maybe other things take priority because this isn't so important in certain contexts. So you have active commitment. Goals are often a way of signaling a commitment to do something, to achieve something, but it's alongside lots of other commitments which may clash with it. And so they may be limiting the extent to which we pursue it. I'll give you an illustration of that in a moment. Or it could mean a very firm commitment that always or generally, except for extreme circumstances, takes precedence over other commitments. In other words, it's what we're really going to do. It seems to me that these sustainable development goals generally function more like number 2 than number 3. They're things, yes, we should do our bit, we should put some effort into producing them and promoting them, but there's so many other things we should be doing as well that it may or may not be top of the list of what we do. Or should we be thinking of some of these goals as being firm commitments? And I think this can be illustrated, what I'm getting at, by the next slide. Because one of the other things that I'm very interested in, and we are in AFW, is climate change. And, you know, in the COP26, now COP27 coming on, no doubt there will be many strongly worded statements. Oh yes, we are committed to the goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. That will be what is said. But is this really, as climate activists would say, has to be the number one overriding commitment of everyone, governments included, because the consequences of not getting that target are so bad for everyone in the world? Or is it going to be more, as I think most governments treat it as, well, it's obviously something we should be doing something about, but my gosh, we're still going to pursue a lot of other things, economic growth, for instance, because that's important. Now, let me be quite candid. In the situation in which we're in this country with the serious cost of living crisis, we certainly want to do something about getting the economy going better and more equitably for everyone. That's another whole lecture. So I'm not one poo-pooing any concern in economic growth, but I do think that on the whole, governments do not treat the goal, which we all say we have, of net zero by 2050, we do not take it as an overriding goal. We merely treat it as a goal which we will pursue consistent with all other goals that we think are also important but often take priority. So I think there's a real kind of openness about the concept of goals, which has to be acknowledged. Now, don't get me wrong, nothing in what I'm saying is saying, look, the SDGs are not a good idea. I think they're brilliant. I think they're an amazingly important agreement of the international community. But let's face it, that this kind of goals language, in the way it's about, is capable of different kinds of interpretation and different levels of commitment. That's really what I'm trying to get at. And I think we kid ourselves if we think, oh, we've all got these goals, then fine. Even if people say they, or governments say they have these goals, they may not be doing enough. And so that leads to the question, well, what would strengthen these commitments to these goals? Whether by governments, by citizens. And I'm going to argue right at the end that actually these are not independent of each other, is that the commitment by governments to these goals is partly a function of what its citizens are committed to or believe is important to achieve. They're not independent. So that's right at the end. So I'm interested in this question, what will strengthen these commitments? Now, there are lots of other arguments that could be used as well. But I'm just going to focus in the idea of a moral rights basis, because I've been interested in human rights and moral rights for a long time. So let's turn to the next slide. So what is the right to water then, and how do we understand it? First, just a note on rights more generally. Human rights, which I think that we're talking about here, are universal moral rights that are held equally by all human beings unconditionally. In other words, people have them, whether or not they're actually respected or acknowledged or not by actual governments or people. They may maltreat them. And what ideally international human rights law tries to reflect this idea of human rights as moral rights, and I can spend a lot more time on that. And there are all sorts of moral theories for why we should accept a human rights framework, ranging from traditional natural law theory and Catholic moral theology through to all sorts of modern, more philosophical defenses of the concept of human rights. But I just want to stress that talking about universal moral rights, of which I think the right to water is one, is to be contrasted with other talks of rights. Because often we talk about domestic legal rights. In particular countries, all sorts of people have rights to this, that, and the other. Other people don't have rights to this, that, and the other. And they may or may not recognize the right to water in the way that we think it should be. Likewise, moral rights can be conventional. They can be the customs of particular societies. So in some traditional societies, men have rights over women, which we regard as utterly intolerable. But they were rights in the culture at that time, and still is in many places. And you might say even here to some extent. But I mean, it's I see Paul is smiling there. But what I'm saying is that these ideas of conventional rights, the customs that are there, do not match necessarily what moral rights are about, nor the legal rights. And rights are not, these moral rights are not negated just because they're not acknowledged or honored. So I want to talk about the right to water in this basic moral sense. At a basic level, it's the right to proper access to sufficient clean or potable water to meet one's basic needs for drinking, cooking, sanitation, including washing and ablution. So that's the basic idea of the rights. It's to have access to sufficient clean and potable water to meet one's basic needs for drinking, cooking, etc., sanitation. And one might add, it should be on a sustainable basis. It's not just this week or this month. It's indefinite. So the sustainability concept is implicit there. So that's the basic thing we're talking about. All right, next slide. I would add, though this might be a little bit more tricky and controversial, but if we're talking about the basic right to water, basic right to water is in access, where appropriate, to sufficient water necessary for meeting other basic needs. For instance, if you're a poor farmer in a poor part of the world, you may grow your own food, and you need a lot more water to grow your own food than for drinking, sanitation and washing and so on. So if that water is essential to your being able to have sufficient food to eat or sufficient food to sell to buy the food you need or everything else for basic living, then that water is part of your basic entitlement for your livelihood. So for some circumstances, water is more water is, as it were, seen as a part of the basic structure. Because most of us, it's implicit because we pay the rates and we have the water that comes through the taps anyway. So so I just wanted to add that because it seems to me it's a dimension that's less focused on sometimes. That when we talk about the right to sufficient water, potable water, yes, that's the primary thing. But in many contexts, it has to be the additional water because it's essential to meeting your basic needs in other ways. So a very large proportion of the population, of course, don't enjoy this right or have it fulfilled. This doesn't mean they don't have the right at a moral level. As I said before, ethically rights exist even if not realized. So that's the key idea I wanted to suggest is that what the right to water means. Next slide. And this is, perhaps I won't say so much because I don't want to take too long. This is just examples on this page. I will be making the PDF, the PowerPoint available for everyone if they want to read the full works. But I'll just here give a number of examples of how it's very difficult for people to get sufficient water because of all the impediments that they face in and the problems that arise. For instance, the absence of hygienic toilets leads to disease and so on and so forth. Often shortage of water leads to inability to reach subsistence and catch crops, which I mentioned before. So I won't say more on this slide at the moment. You can read it later in your own time if you want to look at that. So next slide. Sorry, I'm keeping you busy, Paula. Now this is a little bit more light touch philosophical. I hope it's not going to be such as to put people off. I've been really fascinated with the whole idea of basic rights, partly because I read a book many years ago by Henry Shue on basic rights, which I footnote in the references. Because it seems to me to talk about the right to water or the right to food and so on is in fact a very complicated right. And it's a right which has three elements which are linked to three kinds of obligation that other people have in respect to your rights. So I want to argue, as the broader task on another occasion, to say that when we talk about rights in this sense, then these rights always have three kinds of obligations in the background. The first one may seem a bit not necessarily stated the way, but it's the right to be able to get water by your own efforts, including the right to buy it if you have sufficient resources. And in a country like this, we pay rates, so that's how we are paying for it. And others have a responsibility not to interfere or stop. And that's like sort of something having a right to property. Other people have a duty not to interfere and take the property away from them. So it's there in the background. But sometimes people do steal other people's water in short of these situations. We might not think it a live issue for us, but it sometimes arises under circumstances. In a way, it's linked to what Dorcas is organising concerned with, which is this fair water footprint idea. Is that because of so much embedded water in many of the things we expect to have, like cut flowers and foods from plant places, that the water that's needed to grow them in other parts of the world, the embedded water, right, may well be water taken away before farmers in those parts of the world. I think Dorcas' organisation is very interested in that whole issue. And that is in a sense a kind of theft. Because it's not like, we don't need it for our basic human rights. We don't need cut flowers from Kenya. But, you know, it's nice, but it's not in the same way basic, in the sense I'm talking about, for continued living healthily. So that is a more significant one than it might look at first, that aspect, that others have a duty not to take it away. But the second one is important, connected with these basic rights. The right to water, like the right to food, is also right to receive water or food when one cannot get it by one's own efforts or paying for it. And this could be for a number of kinds of reasons, like one is too poor, which is often a situation of great poverty in poor countries, or there's a drought or something like that, and so there's no water locally. In a way, it's becoming an issue, not water, but food is becoming an issue in this country. Because, you know, the cost of living crisis, poor people just cannot afford the food they need. And that's why food banks become a desperate last solution. It isn't the best way to do it at all, of course. And so in that kind of situation where, for instance, when it's too poor to get water, or there's drought, or water's so difficult to get till the rivers drying up and you have to walk miles to get it, then it is, one should argue, the responsibility of others, whether individuals, governments, or aid agencies, to come to the aid of those who are deprived of this basic element of human well-being, namely, in this case, water. So the second kind of responsibility attached to the basic right is that others should come to the assistance of those who are deprived of what they have a basic right to, for various reasons. It could be poverty, it could be drought, it could be, in extremis, because it's taken away by someone else. in competitive situations. So there's various causes to why someone might not have enough water, but in those situations where they haven't, and something can be done about it, then it's the responsibility of others to do something about it. Okay, so next slide, please. And for those interested in theory of rights, some of you may have done a course once upon a time on them, these two aspects of rights, which I'm talking about, correspond to the traditional distinction between rights of action and rights of recipients. But I won't say more about that now. More on university lecture type issues. But the thing I want to focus on is the third thing, which is not often fully realized. These two rights, the right not to have something taken away from you and the right to have receive it when you lose it for some reason, you can't get it yourself. These two rights are usually understood in the context of a further more general right. And that's why I'm calling the right to a socio-economic order. It is the responsibility of others to create and sustain that ensures that the above rights are generally realized. I'm just giving you an example because you're slightly puzzled about this. Why do we have an ambulance service? Or why do we have a fire service? It's because we have a standard set of things set up in readiness to respond quickly if tragedy strikes. Somebody has a heart attack or there's a fire in the house. And we regard the civil authorities as responsible to ensure that this kind of thing is it's in preparation, it's in a state of preparedness, it can do the things that are necessary to spring into action rapidly. And if it fails to do so, and there are extenuating circumstances, then they're criticised for failing their responsibility. That's part of what's meant by having the right socio-economic conditions to enable everyone to realise their basic rights to safety in those instances, of course, and health. But I just give that to perhaps an easier example to understand of what I mean by the right to associate from the order in which others standardly have responsibility. So responsibility then provides to provide a socio-economic legal environment in which individuals, generally or in a standard sort of way, do indeed by their own efforts realise its right and have access to adequate water supplies provided by public utilities. In other words, we live in a social environment where things are set up and we get what we need without too much trouble, right? And that's part of the responsibility of society, governments and people supporting them to create that kind of social structure, which includes, as I said, rapid response readiness to deal with situations where something happens and something has to be done about it. So it seems to me that this kind of general framework is just as important to rights as the first two ones, but most people don't talk about it. It's that background condition that creates an environment in which most of us normally get on with our lives and get what we want and what we are right to without difficulty, and other people are assisted when they need to be, quickly. And that's what we have in a country like this on the whole for most things, and of course much less of it exists in poorer countries, and that's where there's the responsibility for the international community to try and create better conditions as well. Right, next slide. And I just brought people's attention to Article 28 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. There are lots of articles that are much studied and discussed. This article, I would reckon, is hardly discussed at all, but it's a very important one. It says, everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. And that's saying what I said in a slightly formal way, isn't it? It's saying we need a social international order in which the rights and freedoms can be fully realized. And that stresses not just the local social, but the international framework. And there's a very interesting set of issues we aren't going to. So what are the extent of the obligations of other countries to support individual countries in their realization of basic rights? And I could talk more about that in discussion afterwards. But I just want to draw your attention to this because most people don't. And I didn't think about it until a few years ago when a postgraduate student gave a lecture at this conference and talked about it. I thought, gosh, yeah, really important. It's worth reflecting on. So, as I've said already, I'll just formally summarize, this right to water is like many other rights, nested in a range of correlative duties or responsibilities on the part of others. Not to prevent appropriate access to water in this instance, to support or develop a publicly organized water supply, which generally enables people to have access to sufficient water, and to aid those who are, for whatever reasons, unable to have access to water, sufficient water. So that's the kind of basic model of the right to water I'm presenting to you. And I didn't need to stress it. I've got how am I getting on the time? Oh, stop there, if you like. But it's not true of all rights, this framework that I've just given. I want to try and contrast it to bring out just what I'm trying to get at. So let's move on to the next slide then. So as I've just said, this framework of responsibility does need to be understood globally, not merely within national jurisdictions. And so it's imperative for the aid and support for development in all countries is premised on moral duties, in my opinion. As some of you know, I've spent much of my latter part of my life writing about and advocating global ethics as a framework for understanding what we do in the world. But, and this is the big but, I'm afraid, like the SDGs, there's a slipperiness here, or a knotty question. Because, as I said, the SDGs raise the question, whose goal and how strong a goal, which I mentioned earlier. Likewise, the question, whose duty is it to do this? Is it states, the international community, corporations, or us individuals as global citizens? I would argue all of them to some extent. But the how much question is a really knotty question, because usually the duty not to deprive, it does seem to be a strong duty. We shouldn't take away basic goods from other people, whatever they are, water, property, food, or whatever. But other duties to come to the aid, to create and sustain appropriate socio-economic arrangements, that is seen as a significant duty, perhaps, but somewhat discretionary. How much do we do? Again, back to the question, how much do we do? And that, again, the challenge for me is, how can we make these commitments to, particularly to the second two kinds of duties, stronger than they are now? Because on the whole, they're not given that much attention or weight, but certainly no more couldn't be made of it. So that, to me, is the key challenge. I haven't been able to answer here. It's another great story about how we strengthen those arguments. But I've tried to create two frameworks for thinking about why we should be doing something about water as a basic right. And of course, the fact that the SDGs were agreed does give some kind of moral energy to the fact that these commitments are there, but is it enough? That's my question. So, next slide, please. I just want here very briefly, I've written it small because it's in some sense less crucial, but I just wanted to make the point that the right to water, in the sense I've argued, is quite different from another sense in which we have a right to water or a right to food. In this other sense, I won't read this out, I'll just look it out, is that someone might say, well, I have a right to any amount of water as long as I can pay for it. If I've got lots of resources, I can have far more water from my swimming pool, or to sprinkle my large garden, blah, blah, blah. And someone said, no, you don't have a right. Yes, I do have a right. I have resources, I'm a free person, I shouldn't be stopped. And so that's, and likewise, someone who's wealthy can say, I have a right to any amount of food. I can go to gourmet restaurants, I can buy exotic food all the time. I have a right to it. And in one sense, they do have a right to it. But that's a very different kind of sense of a right to the right I'm trying to talk about. In this sense of a right, it's not wrong, generally speaking, for you to do that. There's no law. You might have a legal right to do it. And in many contexts, it's not wrong for you to use the resources to get extra food or more water for your swimming pool or whatever. But that doesn't mean other people have a duty to make sure you get it. Baby can't say, well, I've got a swimming pool, it's your duty, Nigel, to make sure I've got enough water in my swimming pool. We regard that as ridiculous. Whereas if you were really short of water, you might say, well, come on, Nigel, help me get some enough water to live on. So there's another very interesting kind of right at work here called libertarian rights, and that's a whole other story. But these are very different from basic rights in the sense that I'm talking about. So when someone says I have a right to any amount of food if I can buy it, yes, you have. It's not wrong for you to do it, generally speaking, other things being equal. But it's not something I or anyone else has a duty to make sure you get. So it's a very different sense of right there. But even then, things are not always equal. In a drought, a water shortage, then the person who wants all his water for his pool or whatever is not right morally to exercise a legal right, even if there isn't a formal restriction imposed. And so there are circumstances in which it would be perfectly wrong morally to use water profligately, even if you could pay for it. And so even there, it's not all automatically okay, but generally speaking, people make a right to more water, more food than the basic right to food and water, but others don't have a duty to make sure you get it. I hope I've made that distinction clear. I find it fascinating, that contrast. And interesting, as I mentioned earlier, the Glasgow Declaration on Fair Water Footprints, which Dorcas told us about on one occasion, that also, as I've already implied, has the challenge of embedded water, because if we consume water that's embedded because of things the water used elsewhere to produce it, that may have issues of unfairness, precisely because of where the water comes from in that embedded water, and that might, as it were, put pressure on other people whose basic rights are undermined by our demand for the goods that we get. So there's just a quick ditty or digression on that other sense of rights, which I think is important. So Paula, last slide, I think. Yes, please know, last slide, I think I'm within my sort of 2 minutes or so. I just wanted then to turn to this question: what will strengthen a government's commitment to the SDGs, or to play its part more vigorously in realizing the right to water and other essential elements of the right to life for all? As I said, in both cases, the structures, both the rights and the SDGs, leave open a certain question of how much. And that to me is one of the real big issues. And to me, the issue is the how much and how much commitment will be made is a function to some extent of the way we all think about these issues. So the more people who think in a way about the importance of this basic right or these basic rights, the more likely is that something will happen. And so I would argue that it's we the peoples or active global citizens who create, as it were, on the one hand, the kind of space in which governments feel more enabled to act on behalf of those citizens who voice those opinions. It creates a case of energy in the part of agencies to do something about it. If sufficient large number of citizens indicated that they thought this right to water, right to food for everyone in the world was that important that we ought to take actions through aid program, appropriate aid programs, etc., then I think more could happen. But it isn't just our own moral thinking. I've been doing thinking tonight. It's what we do ourselves. We practice what we preach. We walk the talk. But it's also our advocacy, our being willing to talk the walk, if you like, the other way around, to say this is why we do this, and so on. I don't think it'd be a good idea if more of us took these things seriously. So I think there's a very intimate connection between the degree to which governments get committed and what people think. And one of the reasons why a lot of governments don't do very much is an awful lot of citizens don't think they have to follow it. And that's the real problem, particularly in a democracy. Just to finish then with one of my favorite quotes from Henry Shue, the guy I mentioned earlier on. One of his great remarks, I used to say to students, I wish I'd been the first to say this. Do you know the story about Oscar Wilde? As a party about it, Oscar Wilde once heard someone say something very, very witty and clever. Oscar Wilde was reported as saying, oh, I wish I'd said that first. To which the acid reply was, you will, Oscar, you will. Well, I'm not claiming to be the original for this one, but it's that sort of remark, because I think it's just an absolute winner. Basic rights, it should be there. Basic rights are the minimum demand of all humanity, on all humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.